what we want to do now is show how the transcendental insight, which is again the way in which our philosophical naivete is shattered, falls out on this way of conceiving of epoché and of skeptical relationship to phenomenology. So here, obviously, the epoché is purely methodological. Again, there's no sense in which we're trying to mimic being actually uncertain about whether the world exists. Um, the primary goal is actually ontological here. It's to gain access to the region of pure consciousness, and that's what Husserl takes himself to have done in the later parts after he's done the epoché. Um, Now, to justify the idea that we can continue to investigate the structures of the world that make it meaningful in the absence of positing the actual existence of the world, there's a kind of move from actuality to possibility here, a move that is very problematic as it's shown up in various guises in the history of philosophy. There's lots of debate, not just in phenomenology and not always in these terms, but there's lots of debate about whether our knowledge can be based in possibility or whether it has to be based in things that are actually true and actually existing. So, to show Husserl's view is that the world structures are independent of actual existence, and in some sense, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. But Husserl's general view is that we can study the possible structures of the world independently of its actual existence. And he shows this in Ideas 1 by putting forward a very famous thought experiment called the annihilation. The annihilation thought experiment says, even if the entire world were to stop appearing, so to set that up a little bit, imagine or consider your experience and first notice that it's not ever just a random, completely unintelligible change and flux. There are patterns and regularities in which the consciousness changes over time, and that allows you to make sense of your experience. And as long as there's this sort of unified, harmonious unfolding of experience where you turn your head and what your field of vision changes continuously, and everything seems to be staying together in the correct way. As your experience unfolds harmoniously in that way, and you're able to kind of piece what's coming in with what you've just seen, and everything seems to fit, that continuously reinforces this naive default belief in the world. And Husserl says it's imaginable or it's thinkable that all of those harmonious relationships between the phases of your experience should fall asunder, and yet the experiential core remains. So just imagine that all of those regularities dropped out and you just got sort of a slurry of incoming sights, sounds, colors, and the rest of it without any discernible pattern. In such a case, we would have consciousness, but we would lack a world. Consciousness would not be able to constitute a world. There would be no sense in which, we could say, tomorrow I've got an appointment and I've done all these things in the past and I can travel to this place and I can, if I walk 10 meters in a straight line over there, I can just reverse that, walk 10 meters back and arrive back at the same place. None of that sort of world understanding, world model that we have would be in place, and yet there would be some bubbling experience there. So consciousness and the unities of consciousness are not themselves in the world because they are what condition the world. So Husserl draws the conclusion that consciousness has a sort of being that is absolute, whereas nature and the world has a sort of being that's relative to consciousness. Now, Husserl's ontological formulation of being, consciousness as a region of pure being, I don't think he gives up that view, but it will play a much less central role as the skeptical dimension of phenomenology continues to take prominence. Not that it becomes a skeptical philosophy, but that the conception of phenomenological method gets tied more closely into an epistemic and skeptical critique of our ordinary knowledge. Now, although this version of phenomenology is completely continuous with later developments that we'll look at later on, at the same time, it also does provide a very distinctive and, in my opinion, slightly less compelling entry into phenomenology, because for Husserl, this entryway into phenomenology is less necessarily motivated by the train of reflections. There's a sense in which we just kind of have to almost arbitrarily take up an interest in phenomenology here, as opposed to sort of being led, as Husserl will later try to do, lead us from the idea of philosophy to the necessity of phenomenology. There's less necessary structure here. In Ideas 1, when Husserl is introducing the phenomenological epoché, he says, and this is a quote, "Instead of remaining in the natural attitude, we propose to alter it radically. What we must now do is convince ourselves of the essential possibility of the alteration." So there's this possible alteration to the natural attitude, and it's the key to becoming to developing philosophy properly. But it kind of hovers out there. It's just this sort of ideal possibility that we can always make use of. Later on, Husserl will use a more epistemological argument to take us directly there. Here it's just kind of, we can do this, let's start exploring it. And it comes off the heels of an ontological analysis of being in the first part, and then Husserl tries to show that these ontological structures, the structures of being, do not depend on positing, and we can nullify our positing of the world, and yet the essential structures of the world remain. Now, moving ahead from 1913 to 1923, Husserl, we're looking at the first philosophy lectures. Husserl has obviously had now a decade, 10 years to keep thinking about phenomenology. And as I've said before, I don't think there's any radical discontinuities, but I do think there's some seriously important developments and deepenings which actually better capitalize on some of the things that Husserl was trying to do in Ideas 1. So the connection between phenomenological epoché and skepticism here is much more explicit. It's drawn outright. Husserl spends a good deal of time in the early parts of the lectures discussing skepticism and setting up the epoché in relation to that. Here, the epoché is not just this method. You remember in Ideas 1, it's just sort of, Husserl says, here's this thing we can do. It's this essential possibility which is built into the structure of consciousness to suspend the natural attitude. But here, that move of suspension and breaking out of naivete is actually necessitated by the apodictic inadequacy of natural experience and the kind of evidence that we get out of natural experience. The evidence of natural experience is shown to be inadequate and to fail what Husserl calls an apodictic critique. So this is much closer to an actual skeptical critique of natural evidence, or the kind of evidence that's involved in the naive natural attitude. So what we get here is this sort of epistemic standard that we derive from our meditation on the history of philosophy, and we show that natural experience can't possibly measure up to this historically given standard. and he'll make that even stronger in the Cartesian Meditations, where he thinks that it's part of the very idea of philosophy itself, and phenomenology. The shattering of naivete becomes a condition of possibility for philosophy to appear in the world. So, so you can see a development here in terms of which, and that development can be made legible by kind of tracing the relationship between phenomenology and skepticism, as we're doing here. So in developing the phenomenological epoché here in the first philosophy lectures, Husserl tries to systematically critique natural experience in what's called an apodictic critique. Now, apodictic just means certain, and he associates apodicticity with, again, the history of philosophy, that philosophy is supposed to be an absolute self-justification and apodicticity. Now, the evidence of natural mundane experience can't possibly underwrite that philosophical idea of apodicticity. That's what the apodictic critique of natural experience is supposed to show. So this comes out of, as opposed to the kind of ontological considerations that Husserl engages in the Ideas 1, this comes out of a much more epistemic stance in which Husserl undertakes to critique natural experience and lead us to phenomenological epoché by a phenomenological examination of how perception works. So he points out that some well-known phenomenological tropes, that perception is horizontally structured, that is to say it's open. For each point of view we can take on some perceptual object, there are other points of view that are suggested by that, and often whatever we kind of anticipate being true from that other point of view turns out to be so, and we just keep going on. So, for example, if you see a red ball and you kind of anticipate that it's red uniformly and all around it, and then you twist the ball around your hand, there it is, it's red, so everything's folding up just great. But it's also open to correction, and that's an important part about evidence. For Husserl, evidence, by its nature, we have to be wrong sometimes. Or evidence, that's part of the sense of evidence, is that we correct it over time, or we deepen it, we make it better, and that will involve so things like correcting a previous mistake is not some external aberration. It is part of what evidence is. It's part of the intentional structure of evidence, that other evidence corrects it and suggests different paths, and so on and so forth. So there is no conceivable, Husserl thinks it's absolutely nonsensical to suppose that there would ever be a complete closure of perceptual givenness. In other words, that as I look at some physical object, I see all sides of it once, nothing is left open, nothing is open to correction of future perceptions. Not even God, says Husserl in an illustrative sense, not even God looks at a material object from all sides at once. That is just a countersense. It goes against what the nature or the essence of a material object is. It's to be splayed out, to be in this horizontally open anticipatory structure. And as a result, it's conceivable that the sort of whole total evidence that we have, the overall coherent and harmonious character of our evidence, it should itself end up being illusory or overturned by future evidence. So it's conceivable that the tree I'm looking at outside the window will turn out not to exist, and all the way up to it's conceivable that due to the horizontal openness of our experience, that some experience will come around that completely globally cancels the abiding sense that there is a world. And so the natural attitude is contingent on this phenomenological structure, which continuously gives birth to it and continuously reinforces it and continuously maintains it. So it's not just that we're kind of moving from ontology as actual being to ontology as possible being, as kind of what happens in Ideas 1, but the annihilation of the world is now properly understood as the opening of a new field of experience. Experience in the natural attitude is non-apodictic. What we need is a kind of experience. And this is where Husserl is moving to. Philosophy is a form of experience, a form of reflective experience. Its knowledge is no less experiential than empirical science, but that's the sort of experience that Husserl has in mind is of a different kind. So you can see that the first philosophy account of this kind of Cartesian way into the reduction, and it's really is more sophisticated, more nuanced. It doesn't just suggest the possibility of the epoché. It says the essential inadequacy of natural evidence necessitates it, and from there we can explore the domain of phenomenology with a sort of different kind of experiential character. Now, in solving some of those other problems, in characterizing the phenomenological transcendental insight in experiential epistemic terms instead of ontological terms, and in presenting the epoché and the transcendental insight as a necessary outcome of the historical tradition of philosophy and of the apodictic critique of natural experience, now a major new problem surfaces, which is that if phenomenology is itself a kind of experience, that we're gathering experiential knowledge, then it too has that character of experiential knowledge, which experiential knowledge is never immune to future revision. So if phenomenological knowledge is subject to that same kind of experiential incompleteness as is natural attitude knowledge, then it's not clear that this realm of evidence that's supposed to be more fundamental is any more reliable than the one that we critiqued. So it's supposed to be the outcome of this critique, but it itself maybe seems subject to the very same critique. That is to say that it's non-apodictic, unreliable evidence. It's experiential. Enter the 1929 to 1931 development of the Cartesian path. This is the most mature statement that we'll get from Husserl about the Cartesian path, which associates phenomenology with skepticism, which is again what this video is about. So looking at the Cartesian Meditations can give us a kind of final view of Husserl's mature thinking on the relationship between phenomenology and skepticism. It's the strongest case for phenomenological epoché, in my opinion, that Husserl ever put forward. And the reason for that is that it takes all of the improvements from the 1923 lectures and distills them down even more to something more stripped down and therefore more elegant, more economical, and more compelling. Husserl sticks with this more experiential formulation of the Transcendental Insight, and so it's not too ontological. Moreover, he presents it as the necessary outcome of the apodictic critique, but he does that. Here's why it's stronger than the 1923 version. The suspension of the natural attitude is presented as the necessary consequence of the very idea of philosophy, of a science-seeking ultimate self-justification. The epoché, the phenomenological reduction, is demanded internally by the very idea of philosophy itself, not by this grand historical narrative. So it sheds a lot of this excess weight. As interesting as the historical narrative is in the 1923 lectures, he has a much more streamlined approach here, and it makes for a stronger argument. Now, Husserl calls the 1923 1931 lectures, his Cartesian Meditations. And the reason for that is obviously he rejects almost all of Descartes' positive doctrines. This is his Cartesian Meditations because finally it tightens things up in compared to 1923. The work adopts a genuinely Cartesian form in the sense that it's a sequence of meditations that the radically philosophizing subject must pass through in a motivated order, one after another, where each step is necessitated by the evidential situation established in the previous one, under this idea of philosophy as this radical self-legitimization of reason. So Husserl says that's the sort of eternal significance of the Cartesian Meditations, is that they put philosophy in a shape like that, not that they have any particular content. So while Husserl doesn't agree with Descartes about almost anything content-wise, this form of philosophizing, this form of meditating, is suggests that Husserl was more satisfied that these meditations really did proceed in a necessary order of thought as opposed to just an arbitrary one or a possible one. In all of this, the Cartesian Meditations thereby solves that gaping problem of the 1923 lectures, wherein the resulting field of transcendental experience was possibly just as unreliable in its evidence as natural attitude experience. In the Cartesian Meditations, it's shown that that phenomenology doesn't stand in need of absolutely apodictic evidence across the board. The apodictic critique is sufficient when it unseats the natural attitude in order to disclose the idea that philosophy is another kind of experience. That's the role that apodicticity plays, and we don't need to show that every phenomenological statement is absolutely certain in its evidence. We just need to show that phenomenology and philosophy more generally don't make any sense. We can't understand what the motivations are for them if we remain in the natural attitude. That's the core way that we are unseated from the natural attitude. So phenomenology doesn't need to show itself to be apodictic before we can get going exploring the field of experience. A major objection is, I think, taken care of in the Cartesian Meditations. Here, Husserl also refines the formulation of the resulting Transcendental Insight. I'll quote it directly. The Transcendental Insight now is the world that exists for me, that always has and always will exist for me, the only world that can ever exist for me, this world, with all its objects, derives its whole sense and existential validity, which it has for me, from me, myself. Okay, so first of all, we can compare that to the original Ideas 1 Transcendental Insight, which formulated it as consciousness is absolute being, very ontological. We can also contrast it with the 1923 version, which simply differentiated the two fields of experience. This is a much stronger claim in which Husserl says that everything I can know, everything that I can understand about the world is something that has to be drawn into the unity of my experience. I can't know anything that doesn't have some place in the overall total content and character and form of my experience. That leads Husserl to maybe his strongest sort of philosophical formulation of phenomenology that he had ever come across, when he claims that phenomenology is necessarily transcendental idealism. Once the standpoint of the epoché has been understood, as we've understood it here, Husserl thinks the resulting science is necessarily a kind of transcendental idealism. And so transcendental idealism is not a doctrine added onto phenomenology from without, and it's the stance that necessarily arises when the method is consistently carried through. It's that stance, again, that the world's existence and sense can only be constituted in my consciousness. Therefore, nothing that falls outside of what has been constituted for me can be understood as part of my world. I have to constitute the sense of my experience, and that's why phenomenology is deeper. It talks about that constitution aspect, those processes of constitution, whereas the natural attitude just takes the results, the already formed results of that constitution. I have to bring sense to my world so I can then rediscover what that sense is through this kind of reflective methodology. To conclude our discussion of skepticism and phenomenology, let's go to one of Husserl's most provocative statements about skepticism. He says that skepticism rots the human spirit, but at the same time provides a path to a higher human spirit. So what he means by that is that skepticism disrupts our naivete, but if we stay in skepticism and wallow there in uncertainty and doubt and the lack of knowledge, that's not what he thinks skepticism has the power to do. Instead, it has the power to move us to the transcendental insight, and in so doing come to grasp the deepest motivations for philosophy.